You can support In the Past Lane by buying some of our merchandise, like shirts, hoodies, mugs, and stickers. Just go to our website, inthepastlane.com. Thanks.
We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more
to huddled masses yearning to breathe free.
Consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill.
That all men and women are created equal.
Give me liberty or give me death.
Nobody's free until everybody's free.
And the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Hi there. Welcome to In the Past Lane, the podcast about American history and why it matters. Brought to you by SBI, Snoring Beagle International. I'm your host, historian-at-large Edward T. O'Donnell, and this is episode 182. Every week here at In the Past Lane, I bring you the key events and birthdays of notable people that took place this week in U.S. history, with special attention to one important story. So what's happening in the Past Lane this week? Well, don't look now, but there's definite evidence that spring is coming to New England. Suddenly, it seems like there's daylight from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m., and even though the thermometer seems to be stuck in the 30s and 40s, it somehow feels warmer. And this Friday, February 28th, the college where I work shuts down for spring break. That is always a great opportunity to catch my breath and to get ready for the second half of the semester. And of course, to get organized on upcoming episodes of this podcast. All right, let's get on with it. Here's what happened in American history this week. Let's start with this. 80 years ago this week, on February 29th, 1940, the film Gone with the Wind swept the Academy Awards. This blockbuster film, one of several classics to come out in the remarkable year of 1939, which also included the films Stagecoach and The Wizard of Oz, was based on the best-selling book by Margaret Mitchell. Mitchell was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1900. Her parents imparted to her very different influences. From her father, a prominent lawyer and president of the Atlanta Historical Society, she grew up listening to stories about old Atlanta and the glories of the Confederacy. From her mother, a woman of more radical leanings who was active in the suffrage movement, Mitchell developed her independent personality. After studying briefly at Smith College in Massachusetts, she returned to Atlanta and became one of the first women to land a job as a journalist at the Atlanta Journal. In 1925, she married John Marsh, and 1 year later, while recovering from an ankle injury, she began writing a work of fiction that became Gone with the Wind. Mitchell actually finished the 1,000-page manuscript in 1926, but had a hard time finding a publisher. The book was finally published in 1935 and became an instant hit, selling over 1 million copies within the first 6 months. The following year, it won the Pulitzer Prize. And by the time of Mitchell's death in 1949, more than 8 million copies had been sold in 40 different countries. The essential story is by now familiar to most people. In the beginning, the reader is immersed in an idyllic world of the antebellum South and the plantation-owning elite. But when the Civil War breaks out, the brave sons of the South march off to fight the Yanks, and the Old South begins to crumble. At the center of this story is the tempestuous Scarlett O'Hara and her fight to both save her family plantation, the much-loved Tara, and to win the heart of the strong and dashing Rhett Butler. With the success of the book, a film adaptation was inevitable. Mitchell sold the film rights to the famed producer David O. Selznick for $50,000. News of the forthcoming film generated a lot of excited anticipation among fans of the book. But not all Americans were thrilled. African Americans rightly understood Mitchell's book as a deeply racist depiction of a lost cause version of slavery, the Confederacy, and Reconstruction. In her telling, enslaved African Americans were simple-minded people who were content with slavery and loved their white owners. And Mitchell celebrated the Ku Klux Klan as an organization that rescued the South from the alleged deportations of emancipated blacks and Northern carpetbaggers. African Americans knew that it was this twisted version of the Civil War and Reconstruction that was used by white supremacists to justify Jim Crow, lynching, and segregation. So, they mobilized against Gone with the Wind long before the filming began. They began a letter-writing campaign to producer David Selznick, urging him to drop the project. "We consider this work to be a glorification of the old rotten system of slavery, propaganda for race hatreds and bigotry, and excitement of lynching," wrote one group of African Americans from Pittsburgh. Several African American newspapers threatened to boycott, not just Gone with the Wind, but any film made by Selznick. In the end, the pressure didn't stop the film from being made, but it did convince Selznick to, very reluctantly, delete the N-word from the script. Gone with the Wind premiered on December 15, 1939 in Atlanta, and quickly broke all existing box office records. For white Americans, the film represented a compelling fusion of romance and history. For many African Americans, however, Gone with the Wind was just what they feared it would be, a racist Technicolor extravaganza that told a white supremacist version of the history of slavery, the Confederacy, and Reconstruction. It was, they charged, nothing more than a milder and prettier version of the original American blockbuster, The Birth of a Nation, which had been released in 1915. That infamous film celebrated the Ku Klux Klan as heroes who saved the South from the horrors of racial equality. The film version of Gone with the Wind avoided any references to the KKK, but it did present enslaved African Americans as happy and content people who love their white owners. These characteristics are embodied in the role of Mammy, an enslaved woman in the O'Hara household who remains cheerfully devoted to Scarlett and the family through all their travails. In the film, there's no evidence of the violence, coercion, and exploitation that actual slavery was based upon. Mammy was played by Hattie McDaniel, and she received both praise and criticism from African American leaders. Some adopted a practical position, arguing that because there were so few roles in Hollywood available for African Americans, black actors should seize any opportunity that came their way. Others, however, said the portrayal of black characters in Gone with the Wind was demeaning and that it played to racist stereotypes. Hattie McDaniel herself admitted that she was conflicted, but ultimately decided to make the most of the opportunity. When Gone with the Wind was released, many African Americans participated in protests outside of theaters showing the film. They carried signs that took aim at its rosy depiction of slavery. "You'd be sweet too under a whip," read one sign carried outside a Washington, D.C. theater. And another, "Gone with the Wind glorifies slavery." At the Academy Award ceremonies in 1940, Gone with the Wind won 10 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. Its director, Victor Fleming, earned Best Director honors, while Vivien Leigh won Best Actress for her portrayal of Scarlett. And here's where things got complicated. Best Supporting Actress went to Hattie McDaniel for her portrayal of Mammy. On the one hand, McDaniel made history by becoming the first African American to win an Academy Award. On the other, she did so by playing what critics then and now saw as a racist caricature of an enslaved woman. Hattie McDaniel responded to the criticism by arguing that Hollywood would have found someone to play the role, if not her, and she said she did her best to portray Mammy as a positive character. As she put it, "You can best fight any existing evil from the inside." The next black woman to win an Academy Award? Halle Berry, more than 60 years later in 2001. Despite the criticism, Gone with the Wind lived on as a classic for many, many decades. The book remained in print year after year through countless editions, and the film likewise enjoyed several revivals. But with the civil rights movement of the 1960s and 1970s came more scrutiny of the racism found in the book and film. This scrutiny intensified as a new generation of historians rejected the lost cause version of slavery, the Civil War, and Reconstruction in favor of an interpretation that exposed the violence and cruelty of slavery and the remarkable success of Reconstruction that was ultimately overthrown by a white supremacist counter-revolution that imposed the Jim Crow racial order. Gone with the Wind still has fans, including, apparently, President Donald Trump, who just a few days ago slammed the Academy Awards for awarding a South Korean film, Parasite, Best Picture honor. Trump said at a rally, "Can we get Gone with the Wind back, please?" But Gone with the Wind is now increasingly seen as a relic of a time when the nation was thoroughly segregated, when most African Americans could not vote, and when most white Americans considered the South's defeat in the Civil War not a victory for human rights and democracy, but rather a tragedy unjustly visited upon a noble people. So what else of note happened this week in U.S. history? February 24th, 1803, Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, John Marshall, issued his landmark ruling, Marbury v. Madison. The specifics of the case are almost irrelevant. What mattered was that Marshall claimed, largely out of thin air, that the Supreme Court had the power of judicial review, that is, the power to declare laws constitutional or unconstitutional. No such power is mentioned in the Constitution, but Marshall's declaration went unchallenged, and over time came to be accepted as fact. This, by the way, is a bit of history that will make any so-called originalist very uncomfortable. And if you want to learn more about this topic, check out In the Past Lane, episode 94. February 25th, 1870, 150 years ago this week, Hiram Revels of Mississippi became the first African American sworn in as a member of the United States Senate. Revels had been born a free man in 1827 and grew up to become an educator and a minister. He settled in Mississippi after the Civil War and entered politics. His arrival in the Senate symbolized a revolution of multiracial democracy that was taking hold in the post-Civil War South during Reconstruction, as millions of emancipated African Americans voted and thousands won political office. But the racist opposition that Revels and other African American members of Congress faced foretold the eventual counter-revolution that eventually reimposed white supremacy in the South. February 27, 1973, some 200 members of the American Indian Movement occupied the town of Wounded Knee in South Dakota. They were demanding justice for Native Americans and chose Wounded Knee, the site of an 1890 massacre of hundreds of Native Americans by the U.S. military, for its symbolic value. Police and later federal marshals surrounded the protesters, beginning a prolonged standoff that involved frequent exchanges of gunfire. The protesters eventually surrendered after 71 days. Their demands were not immediately met, but the incident did bring attention to the deplorable condition of affairs on many reservations. Other events of note this week: February 24, 1868, the U.S. House of Representatives voted to impeach President Andrew Johnson. February 25, 1836, Samuel Colt received a patent for his repeating revolver. And March 1, 1961, President John F. Kennedy established the Peace Corps. And what notable people were born this week in American history? February 24, 1836, artist Winslow Homer was born in Boston, Massachusetts. Homer is one of this historian's top 2 favorite American artists. He painted and drew some really important works in the post-Civil War American South, especially scenes depicting the lives of emancipated African Americans. Later, he focused on seascapes along the New England coast. And I know you're wondering, who's my other top 2 artist? Edward Hopper, of course. And here's a fun fact that might explain my affinities. Both Homer and Hopper painted some of their most remarkable works in my hometown, the seaside port city of Gloucester, Massachusetts. February 24, 1928, writer, social activist, and socialist leader Michael Harrington was born in St. Louis, Missouri. Harrington, who incidentally graduated from the college where I work, College of the Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts, is best known for his landmark book about the extensive but hidden poverty in the United States, The Other America, which was published in 1962. This work was a major inspiration for the anti-poverty measures undertaken by the John F. Kennedy administration, and for the subsequent war on poverty launched by the administration of Lyndon Johnson in the mid-1960s. February 26, 1846, Western scout, buffalo hunter, and showman William Cody, a.k.a. Buffalo Bill, was born in LeClaire, Iowa. Cody was working in the West as a guide in the 1870s when a writer in New York City named Ned Buntline began publishing dime novels of Western adventures featuring a character loosely based on him named Buffalo Bill. Cody eventually went to New York City to perform on stage as Buffalo Bill. And in 1883, keenly aware of the insatiable appetite among Americans for tales of the Old West, he founded Buffalo Bill's Wild West. Essentially a Western-themed circus, it dazzled audiences for the next 35 years and played a major role in popularizing many myths about the American West and the frontier. February 27, 1902, the great African-American singer Marian Anderson was born in Philadelphia. Anderson was a world-famous contralto in the late 1930s when an effort to schedule one of her performances at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. was blocked by the group that controlled that venue, the Daughters of the American Revolution. They refused to allow an African-American to sing at the historic site. So, in stepped Eleanor Roosevelt, who arranged to have Anderson sing an outdoor Easter Sunday concert at the Lincoln Memorial. Thousands turned out for the concert, and millions listened to it on national radio. Years later, Marian Anderson said, "I forgave the DAR many years ago. You lose a lot of time hating people." Okay, time for the last word. Let's give it to Hiram Revels, who 150 years ago this week became the first African American to serve in the U.S. Congress. Here's an excerpt from a speech he gave in 1871, in which he noted the bitter racism that African Americans faced during Reconstruction. "I find that the prejudice in this country to color is very great, and I sometimes fear that it is on the increase. For example, let me remark that it matters not how colored people act. It matters not how they behave themselves, how well they deport themselves, how intelligent they may be, how refined they may be, for there are some colored persons who are persons of refinement. This must be admitted. The prejudice against them is equally as great as it is against the most low and degraded man you can find in the streets of this city or in any other place. This, Mr. President, I do seriously regret. Is this prejudice right? Have the colored people done anything to justify the prejudice against them that does exist in the hearts of so many white persons, and generally in one great political party in this country? Have they done anything to justify it? No, sir." Well, that's going to do it for In the Past Lane this week. You can learn more about me and everything we talked about at inthepastlane.com. And let's interact via social media. I'm at In the Past Lane on both Twitter and Instagram, and our Facebook page is In the Past Lane Podcast. See you next week.
SBI, Snoring Beagle International.